Today's top picks from Reuters Breaking Views. The IMF slashes its global growth forecasts. It now expects the world economy to grow 3.3% this year. That's the slowest since the recession of 2009. And decades of higher interest rates lie in store for nations caught in a vicious cycle of high government debt. With me now to discuss these stories is Reuters Breaking Views Assistant Editor Chris Hughes. Chris, two pieces that you've got on the IMF, but let's start with the first one on these high yield levels. Surely the experience of Japan over the last 10-15 years suggests that high yields are not in store for these countries.
Well, that's not the IMF's view, I have to say. It's not a gloomy report from the IMF. I mean, normally they're too optimistic, not this time. And their assessment is there's a sort of terrible interplay between ageing populations, bidding up savings and existing high government debt that all adds up to upward pressure on long-term interest rates and yields. Obviously, at the moment, you've got the Fed essentially trying to convince everyone that rates are going to stay low for longer. The IMF has got a view it's looking further out, and it's pretty gloomy stuff. Now, it's worth saying that the IMF's record on forecasting the future is pretty patchy, but if you believe them, the conclusion from this has to be, why on earth would you want to own the debt of rich countries if the IMF's outlook is right? I mean,
what if the IMF's outlook isn't right though? Look at Japan,
it's a question
low growth, slow growth, ageing population. Central bank buys all the bonds. You've got
on that basis, the debt of rich countries is screaming good value. Look, at some point there's going to be a turn in the rate cycle. At some point it will ultimately normalise, but I mean, that is being pushed out further and further. Whether it's really wise to dwell too much on this gloomy forecast from the IMF right now, I'm not so sure.
Another piece on the IMF that you guys have done, you touch on the fiscal multipliers. Of course, that's how much GDP swings in relation to government spending cuts or spending itself. What's your take on that?
Well, I'd say the perennially wrong IMF is focusing on this question of the fiscal multiplier. It's not quite as complicated as it sounds. You put it very well. Clearly there is an effect when governments spend or they cut in terms of a knock-on effect on GDP. They don't sort of cut in a vacuum. Now, the IMF's concern about the extent to which the economy moves when governments act is fuel for the anti-austerity lobby, because essentially the IMF is saying, look, heavens above, GDP falls much more than we thought when governments cut, and that only makes things worse. Our position on this is, frankly, the reality is if you've got a country facing bankruptcy, it needs to cut. The tree that is pruned produces more fruit.
And I've got one word to that. Yeah. Greece.
Well, no, Greece needs to adjust. I'm afraid that Greece needs to adjust, and it's being given time and scope to adjust in a realistic way. But it doesn't. I mean, I'm afraid that proves the point. Greece really does need to adjust its economy before it can return to growth.
But the austerity is making that growth impossible to achieve.
I'm not so sure. I mean, the challenges of the Greek economy aren't just to do with austerity; they're to do with fundamental structural issues, to do with productivity that need to be addressed.
Well, if not Greece, what about the UK? I mean, the IMF has downgraded its forecast for the UK. The UK enjoys the independent central bank, the devaluation of sterling, etc. It should be in a much stronger position, but it's in recession. Why is that? Nothing to do with austerity, is it?
Well, the UK, there are real doubts about whether the so-called Plan A, which is this very aggressive plan to cut the debt and deficit, is really working. The IMF is inching towards saying, look, you've got to change tack. Previously, it has been quite supportive of Chancellor George Osborne's austerity, but we're now, I think, moving to a space where the government is being given license, not just by the IMF, but also actually by Mervyn King, the Bank of England governor, to miss its debt reduction targets and maybe go for a little bit of stimulus. And actually, we think that would be a good idea. there has to be real attention on cutting spending, but there are capital projects, for example, maybe social housing projects, which can add a little bit of boost maybe to the construction sector, to the broader economy, and would be quite a sensible investment. So we'd advocate that. David
Cameron said today that there's no plan B, there's no need for a plan B. In a word, do you think there should be a plan B?
There needs to be a modification to plan A, and the government is being given licence to do so. It should take it.
OK, Chris, thank you very much. That's all for now. My thanks there to Breaking Views' Chris Hughes. For more agenda-setting financial insight, watch our US Breaking Views show every day at 12:30 Eastern, 17:30 BST. I'm Jamie McGeever. This is Reuters.